Fairview Highway Patrol. It was quite the scenic view as the sun was setting over the ocean, spreading out in a colourful display of nature's beauty. Best experience from the long and winding road along the cliffside, which Morris was currently driving along in the beat-up Cadillac he'd bought for himself. The rugged ride which the car offered was but another chip on his shoulder, though. Deep down, he knew he'd made a mistake running away from home after what he'd done. But that couldn't be helped, he reasoned, as his brow furrowed beneath his short, black, roughed-up hair. They knew what they'd done to him, and the irreversibility of those actions strengthened his belief that his reaction was not just justified, but to be expected. So why was he feeling as rough as he did? To that he found no answer, even after minutes of continuous internal debating with himself as the reds of the sun's dying moments engulfed the interior of the sedan in their splendor. At that point, Morris looked up for a moment to take a glimpse at the brilliant spectacle beyond the horizon. "Neat," he said nonchalantly in his grumbling voice to no one in particular. As he resumed his introspection, a thought that he'd been suppressing in the back of his mind was coming forward. He had no idea where he was driving to, how long he could keep going, or how long the few $100 he'd taken out of his account would last him. Though the young man tried to brush it off, reassuring himself that life always found a way, the rumbling and groaning of his vehicle did put this sentiment into question. As the rocky cliffside gave way to the sprawling evergreen tree forests this part of the country was known for, the sun had now fully set and the stars shone brightly in the night sky. Framed by the forest, the lonely two-lane highway was dividing. Although once again nature's calming serenity failed to make an impact on Morris. But another set of lights surely did. The ones on his dashboard. A dull beep awoke him from the hypnotic, intoxicating effect the open road had on him. Goddamn fuel gauge. At this point he realized that the abrupt nature of his departure had not left him in the best shape for this journey to nowhere. A barely halfway filled tank to start with, and many long hours of restless driving had finally caught up with the runaway. No, any time but now, Morris said, his voice raspy with despair, as he took in his desolate surroundings. He pulled up to the side of the road, leaning his head against the steering wheel and folding his hands atop of his forehead. He breathed a deep sigh before quietly turning off the engine and turning on the courtesy lights as he raised his head from the steering wheel, though it took a few seconds for him to readjust himself. He knew he only had two options: stay put and wait for the morning until someone might come driving down the road who'd hopefully allow him to pinch some gas to continue along his journey, or drive with the last 5 to 10 litres he had in his tank, hoping he might have enough gas to reach a gas station just in time to not be stranded in the middle of the woods in an area he had never been to and know nothing about. He sat in the warm yellow glow of the interior lights for about 5 minutes, weighing his options until, like he was possessed by the devil himself, instinctually turned the key and switched back into first gear, in desperate search, speeding off into the darkness. Heart pounding in his chest, he once again focused on the road ahead of him, both metaphorically and literally. God, what's going to happen? What will I do? Is my bad decision-making... is my bad decision-making going to catch up with me? All these questions raced through his head as he raced along the seemingly endless dark road. He found himself in an endlessly long daze as trees were bushed by the cones of light before him, and then were left behind in the darkness, just as quickly as they'd appeared. All the while his car's instruments blinked away. No signs, no lights, no forks in the road, just the night, the trees and him, barely kept warm by the old car's fledgling heater. This went on for some time until he finally saw something between the distant trees, behind a bend. Morris slowed down as his hazel eyes focused on the mysterious object, trying to make out its nature. It was a tall rectangle, held up by a metal pole firmly planted into the ground. "Fairview Gas and Service," and the letters making up the three-letter word were big and obviously made of red neon signage, while the rest was written in white lettering faded from years of being exposed to the elements. The most noticeable attribute of the sign, as it fully came into Morris's view, was that it wasn't lit up, only being illuminated by the spotlights of his ever-complaining ride, which he quickly turned off as he approached the gas station. The station's streamlined modernist design itself contrasted by its own worn facade and broken plaster, bearing witness to its age, which unnerved Morris even more than he already was, as it made him doubt whether or not it was even still in service. When he drove off the road and onto the gravel surface of the station, he took note of the closed blinds behind the curved windows of the station attendant's office, obscuring the view inside. He took a minute to gather himself and stepped out of his car, his shoes touching the ground for the first time in nearly a day, generating a crunch as they made contact with the gravel. Though the moment of resolve he felt as he stepped out was fairly short-lived, as his legs felt weak and started to buckle after not having been in use for so long. Thankfully, he quickly found hold on the side of his car, slowly righting himself. As he began to really take in the ghostly surroundings, the sound of snoring began to penetrate his ears, which he deduced was coming from inside the station attendant's office. It was quite a loud snore, as it was clearly audible from a good 7 meters away, where Morris was standing, not to mention that it came from inside of the structure. Though Morris was relatively unfazed despite the very sound sleeper, in fact, he realized that this meant that either a couple of very polite and non-destructive but noisy squatters were occupying the building, or that it was definitely still in use, which was fortunate for him. So he decided to use the opportunity that presented itself to him, moved around the back of his car, opened the fuel tank, took one look at the ornate gas pump, grabbed the nozzle, and just as he thought, the unleaded gasoline was pumping, and under the whirring of the pump, the snoring continued. Ding! Morris froze as his heart stopped. The sharp and loud noise the pump emitted surely must have disturbed whomever was sitting inside the building. But to his surprise, the snoring went quiet for a bit, but then resumed. Ding! It rang again as the dials on the pump rounded off 10 gallons of fuel. Morris's heart began to race again, then pound as the liquid within the gauge of the pump kept swirling, and the numbers on the dials climbed higher and higher. 13, 13 and a half, 14, 14 and a half, 15. Ding! Morris stopped squeezing the trigger as he recoiled, pulling the nozzle out as quickly as possible and putting it back where he'd found it, making the pump's motor stop. The fuel cap was put back on as he jumped back inside the car and started the ignition. He knew this opportunity for a free refill was just what he needed, because these $50-odd were the ones he couldn't spare, and thus, after a bit of swift stick shift work, he once again drove off into the night, his tires screeching like a screaming banshee. What he didn't know was that on the other side of the pumps, beyond the rusted-out hull in front of the garage, and between it and the car wash, 2 pairs of beastly eyes were following his entire escapade from the darkness of the night. This is Patrol Car 4, observing green 1983 Cadillac Cimarron with suspicion of criminal activity. Requesting permission to go in for a 1039.
10-4, Patrol Car 4. Permission granted.
Morris kept on driving and never looked back to see if he was being followed. Though he did accelerate as he spotted lights somewhere in the distance which broke the darkness of the night, a glint of hope remained in Morris's eye. Though that, like many other things that night, were quickly snuffed out when a sudden bang rocked the car, and Morris struggled to keep his aging car straight on the road. Nothing can ever go smoothly in my life, can it? He sputtered in anger. Cheap car, cheap tires, cheap everything. Morris's hand smacked the steering wheel as he watched his view shift from the straight white markings on the road to a dirt and leaves covered clearing, the Cadillac coming to a stop just in time before making contact with the underwood. Looking out of the grimy driver's side window, He sighed in quiet despair. "Ah, this is fine. I've got a spare in the back. I'm just going to change it, head into town, stay until morning, and get on with my life." Stepping out of the car, sticks on the ground, rallied up by his vehicle's drift into its current earthly resting place, cracked as he found earthly footing once again, still sore but thankfully not as unprepared for walking as he was previously. The crisp nightly air filling his lungs proved at least a small comfort for him, he noted, even if his burgundy check button-up didn't prove the best insulator. Once again, padding around to the car, Morris found the offender, and just as he suspected, the entire rear left tire was torn up, a mess of rubbery scraps. After a quick disapproving sigh, he took 3 steps and opened the trunk. Morris scanned over the entire space. He hadn't put anything in it since he'd bought the car, so all he had to do was pull out the jack and the tire iron, which he did, laying them on the ground in an orderly fashion in front of the destroyed heap of rubber before him. The mat on the bottom of the trunk was removed to reveal the spare tire underneath. The young man heaved it over the edge of the trunk, and, letting it rest on the forest floor, he then moved to the side and placed the jack under the chassis. He turned the handle clockwise, raised it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, and 3. With the car now raised, next came the 5 lug nuts holding the tire in place. Using the old principle of righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, he grabbed the tire iron and got to work on the first one. Then, after a good 10 seconds, it fell to the forest floor with a dull plunk. Observing the bare pole that the nut left behind, Morris turned the next one. It too gave way after a good dozen seconds. Plunk. Number 3, the nut on the bottom right, followed the pattern its predecessors had laid out. Plink. Morris's worries began to ebb as his brain focused on the manual labor in front of him. Bottom left. Plink. For tidiness' sake, he grabbed the scattered nuts located on the floor and put them into a pile beside the jack before grabbing the tire iron again to remove the last one. And with a few more turns, eventually it too gave, though this time he grabbed the lug nut before it could land on the ground, and it too was put on the pile he carefully assembled previously. Now the mangled tire was free, and before he could grab it, it fell flat forward onto the ground, nearly onto its liberator's shoes, landing in the dirt with a loud thud. This seemed to have alerted something close by, as he heard muffled noises form behind him, though as he turned around to see what was going on, a bright, blinding light enveloped him. He drew his head back as a siren started blaring to accompany it. Morris jolted upward as a strident voice started barking at him. "This is the Fairview Police Department. Drop the tire iron, raise your hands, and step out to the side of the vehicle." Morris did as he was told, his pupils constricting both from the bright light invading his eyes, as well as the realization that his trip had most likely been stopped dead in its tracks. And if someone were to describe the situation he was in, the phrase "caught like a deer in the headlights" would be appropriate, nigh on unavoidable. Meanwhile, the clattering of the tire iron against the ground supplemented the already vibrant soundscape as heavy footsteps drew in closer. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why we interrupted you?" The voice of the as-of-yet unseen origin queried, having transformed from a commanding to a more agreeable tone, albeit with a hint of smugness hiding behind the thin veneer of casualness. Morris tried to answer, but found his lips shut, too startled to move a muscle. After a few seconds, the voice came up right behind him. "Well, doesn't matter." The voice's roughness began to come to the surface again. "We know what you did. We'd like you to put your head on your car and your hands behind your back." "Oh, sir," the voice added, trying to add the disdain for having done so. Morris's brain was still in too much of a shock to process the orders quickly enough, and the leathery feeling of what he guessed to be driving gloves grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and put his head on the lid of his trunk, smacking it shut and exposing more of his face to the bright light that it had partially shielded him from. With his head on the car, The officer then went on to grab Morris's hands and pull them towards his back in one swift motion, which was when Morris noted dull objects digging into the skin of his wrists, where the officer was grabbing him. So out of curiosity, he began to twist his hips and spin his body to see what was going on. Morris instinctively closed his eyes to avoid the blinding light coming from the side as he was doing so, but when he opened them, his face turned from one of shock to one of horror, as the face that was looking back at him wasn't human at all. What was looking back at him was dominated by a slender muzzle, its owner looking somewhat annoyed and startled. The creature's face covered in glossy black and brown fur, tipped off by a blackish red wet nose, twitching as two pointy ears, as black as the night, shot up like the horns of the adversary himself. But before he could process any of this, the brownish claw-tipped hands, or at least something close to such, grabbed his wrists again, turning him around once more. "I'm sorry, pal. I wish you'd just collaborated." The dull piercing of the creature's claws returned as the sound of handcuffs rattling caught Morris's attention, and with a swift crack, he felt the cold metal behind him. One of the beastly hands grabbed him by the fabric of his shirt once more and pulled him closer as the wet muzzle came close to his ear. "Don't worry." Morris stepped one step forward, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "This is all just a bad dream." A loud, throaty heave was heard, the voice abruptly stopping as the captee swung all his weight against his captor. Morris, now freed from the tight grip, took a deep breath as he stepped back, once again taking in all of the sight before him. A 181 tall, uniform-clad dog-man clutching his ribcage, caught up in a cacophony of coughs, with a beaten in his hand and what looked like a veterinary syringe gun holstered on his hip. It was an otherworldly sight which the young man was observing, first with disbelief, then with dread, as a few seconds after the assault on itself, the canid's coughing fit subsided just enough so he could look back up at Morris, pearly white fangs bared and fire burning in its deep amber eyes. His first instinct was to run away, but as soon as he took a step backwards, the beast in front of him lunged and pinned Morris to the dark green back of his car for a third time. "So, this is how you want to play, huh?" the creature said, or at least tried to. The words its mouth formed almost utterly unintelligible, due to a mix of deep, guttural growls and the creature's obviously still remaining shortness of breath. Morris could just make out the soft sound of leather being strafed, before a sharp pain emitted from his lower back. "This ought to make you compliant." Morris had had quite the night. Pain and stress had left his head scattered, his entire world spinning as he was now getting dragged towards the light, his whole skin throbbing and his bones feeling weak. "No, this can't be how it ends," he thought, his brain rather delirious. Finally caught the little guy. What should we do with him now?" "Just procedure. Put him in the back and we'll drive him back to the station," another gruffer male voice responded. Morris's face landed on a woolly surface as his heart started pounding worse and worse. His mind still in a daze, he couldn't hear anything anymore. The world was just faded colors and noise to him as he felt his muscles contort uncontrollably, twisting at weird angles, almost as if his body tried to rip itself apart. A terrible heat was enveloping him all over, and just as he thought the excruciating pain couldn't get any more unbearable, the unmistakable crunch of bone rang in his ears. All that sent him over the edge, his entire world finally fading to black.
Hey there. Thank you so much for taking the time to drop by and listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me. I put a lot of time and effort into making these videos, so it's nice to know that there's someone out there listening. Do me a little favor, would you? Click that like button, leave a comment, and if you really feel like it, why not subscribe too? Okay, happy tales everyone. See you soon.